Welcome, my name is Peter Yang, and today I'd like to make the case for why the practice of philosophy is needed to survive the civilizational crisis that confronts us. Just as Marcellius was aware that something was rotten in the state of Denmark when Hamlet slunk away to confer with the ghost of his murdered father haunting Elsinore Castle, so too are we aware of a rot growing at the core of contemporary consumer society. As the body politic decays and the social fabric speeds its unraveling, we come to see that the narratives through which we lived no longer make any sense. This narrative collapse can be seen in the stories of incoming college students. They arrive having already fought for good grades, letters of recommendation, and even interesting internships. But when asked why they have worked so hard and what they hope to accomplish, they surprisingly don't mention their desire to learn, but instead declare that their sole objective is to get a degree. And when asked why they want a degree, they say this will allow them to get a good job with a high income. And when asked why they want that, they say that this will give them social prestige, and social prestige, a mate, and a mate, marriage and children, so that the process can continue without them and they can finally retire and enjoy their lives. Yet, after earning their degree, they find that the story doesn't unfold as told. Not only do they fail to get what was promised, but they receive its opposite. Instead of a good job, they struggle for a precarious minimum wage position. Instead of prestige, derision. And instead of a happily ever after marriage, ennui, divorce, and abuse. Furthermore, even if the promises did hold true at an individual level, we are confronted with the disastrous communal costs exacted by the standard narrative. We live in a world of environmental degradation and mass extinction. We work ourselves sick only to find that we've been priced out of healthcare. In our mad struggle for success in a business world red in tooth and claw, we find we no longer have a community, but only narrow, self-interested tribes united in their hate. We have lost what Confucius said was most important for a society: trust. Analects 12:7 runs as follows. Sigong asked about government, and the master said, if there's enough food and there are enough weapons, the people will put their trust in it. Sigong said, suppose you definitely had no alternative but to give up one of these three. Which would you relinquish first? And the master said, I would give up weapons. Sigong said, suppose you definitely had no alternative but to give up one of the remaining two. Which would you relinquish first? And the master said, I would give up food. From of old death has come to all men, but a people will not stand if it lacks trust. We have inverted the order of these goods. Not only have we abandoned trust for food, but we have abandoned food for weapons, and even worse yet, pursue weapons for the sake not of protecting the people, but for maximizing profit. We now face the consequences of treating trust as a resource in a con game. Coming to see the extent of this betrayal can be deeply traumatic. The narratives that made sense of our world not only seem to be false, but appear to be deliberately designed to mislead and exploit us. One popular response to this disorientation has been to adopt what I call lazy enlightenment. As we begin to notice and speak about our feelings of betrayal, we meet with others who see the same thing and try to explain it by providing a new narrative. The core of this new narrative is essentially the same, but is spelled out along two antagonistic lines that define two seemingly rival tribes. The core explanation offered by this new narrative goes as follows. Simply by seeing your betrayal, you are now special and one of the enlightened. Furthermore, the reason for your betrayal is that society is controlled by a hostile group conspiring to deceive and persecute you. Your victimhood makes you virtuous, and your life can have meaning when you join with others in our enlightened tribe to fight the enemies of humanity and ultimately purge the world of their evil. We see this same storyline fleshed out in two apparently conflicting ways. On the one hand, we can join the ranks of the so-called red-pilled. Just as Neo in the film The Matrix rejected the illusions of a race of robotic monsters and took the red pill to see reality as it really was, so too can we see through the illusions of liberal elites in government, education, Hollywood, and the media. On the other hand, we can join the ranks of the so-called woke. Just as one awakens from a dream, so too have we awoken from the illusions of a history of intersecting systems of oppression. While I don't doubt the legitimacy of many of the grievances on both sides, I do want to stress how both are instances of lazy enlightenment. For both, you become one of the faithful simply by being aware of your victimhood. And your new community and purpose in life is derived by warring with an enemy thought to be the epitome of evil. The only difference lies in who that enemy is. For the red-pilled, it tends to be feminist, immigrant, transgendered, homosexual liberals. And for the woke, it tends to be patriarchal, white, cisgendered, heterosexual conservatives. The problem with lazy enlightenment is that it doesn't actually solve our problems. It simply speeds and intensifies our divisions, rather than bringing us together and restoring trust. Moreover, it tends to be adopted with the same kind of thoughtlessness that made us susceptible to betrayal in the first place, and has been marshaled by the same forces that deceived and exploited us to begin with. Notice how the outrage of both sides has been monetized by those who would enrich themselves through our misery. Our predicament is similar to that of Dante at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, where he lost his way to awake to find himself in a dark wood, savage as death. He tried to find his way out on his own, but he couldn't. He needed a guide. For Dante, this guide was the poet Virgil, who could guide him to freedom by another route. For us, I suggest the guide can be found in the character of Socrates. For Socrates provides us with an example of how a knowledge of our lack of wisdom can itself lead to wisdom. Plato's Apology recounts Socrates' origin story as a philosopher. Socrates' friend, Cariaphon, is said to have traveled to the Delphic oracle to ask whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. To this the god answered, "None was wiser than Socrates." When Socrates had heard of this, he was incredulous, for he was well aware of his own lack of wisdom. So he went out to the men of the city who were reputed to be wise, to question them, and to show that they were indeed wiser than he was, and that the oracle had to have been mistaken. He spoke to famous politicians, poets, and skilled craftsmen. But when he cross-examined them, they were all proven to be without wisdom. In fact, Socrates concludes that Apollo may have, in a sense, been right. For though Socrates lacked wisdom, he at least knew that he lacked it. And this knowledge of a lack of wisdom can inspire one to search for it. In this manner, Socrates was likened to a figure of Silenus. Figures of Silenus were cheap jars in the shape of the ugly face of Dionysus' drunk teacher of the same name. They were tawdry on the outside, but inside they contained statues of the gods. In the same way, Socrates looked ugly, disheveled, and unskilled, but when you philosophized with him, you could see he held something divine. What then is this practice of philosophy that Socrates can teach us? One way to answer this question is to turn to the academic discipline of philosophy, and look at the fundamental questions it allegedly considers. What is reality, and how is it structured? What is the nature and extent of knowledge or rational justification? Are moral values real? And if so, what makes them binding? This list of questions provides us with a relatively clean, abstract, disciplinary division between metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. But while to an extent useful, it tends to reduce philosophy to yet one more academic discipline among others, and to equate engagement with these questions with mere puzzle solving. A better question-oriented approach is suggested by Kant when he claimed that the interests of reason were encapsulated in three questions. What can I know? What should I do? And for what can I hope? These questions are better at expressing what motivates a life of philosophy. But still, the articulating of these questions doesn't, by itself, tell us how we should go about answering them. To do this, I think it's better to look at the practices of philosophy. If we agree with Socrates that the unexamined life is not worth living, what would the examined life consist in? I'd like to suggest that four practices lie at the heart of philosophy: contemplation, dialectic, creation, and spiritual transformation. To begin, let's consider the practice of contemplation. This practice is perhaps best understood through the Greek concept theoria. Theoria comes from the verb theoreo, which can mean to look at, behold, see, gaze at, contemplate, or consider. This is the verb, for example, used to characterize being a spectator at the Olympics and beholding the games there. The most familiar way for us to think of this concept today would be through the idea of mindfulness, which Jon Kabat-Zinn popularized as, quote, the awareness that arises from paying attention, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. The idea is that if we are to rid ourselves of illusions and reactive thoughts and behaviors so as to act consciously and with integrity, we must first be aware of how things appear to us. We must be cognizant of what we are thinking, feeling, or sensing. And to do this, we need to stand back and observe our experience. Aristotle identified such contemplation with the highest form of life, even going so far as to call it divine. Likewise, this contemplative practice also grounds a philosophical method called phenomenology. According to the great 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger, quote, the term phenomenology expresses a maxim which can be formulated as, to the things themselves. It is opposed to all free-floating constructions and accidental findings. It is opposed to taking over any conceptions which only seem to have been demonstrated. It is opposed to those pseudo-questions which parade themselves as problems, often for generations at a time. Phenomenology means to let that which shows itself be seen from itself in the very way in which it shows itself from itself, end quote. By contemplation, we can thus begin to peel away the accretions of habitual thought that have blinded us to reality. The second core practice of philosophy, dialectic, builds upon this. Dialectic comes from the Greek concept of dialektike, and can, for our purposes, be best understood as a truth-oriented conversation, characterized by its question and answer format, in which various positions are subjected to rational scrutiny. Several features of this definition are worth noting. First, note that the process is truth-oriented. Dialectic is disinterested inquiry. It's not about boosting your ego or improving your self-esteem. Its goal isn't to establish your reputation or that of your tribe. Rather, in dialectic, it is actually better to be refuted than to do the refuting, because the person who is refuted comes closer to the truth. Imagine that you had a disease and believed that you had a cure for it, but before taking it, your friend showed you that you were misguided, and that your putative cure was actually poison. In this case, it is much better to be refuted and learn the truth than to win the argument and drink the lethal potion. Dialectic, then, isn't about owning your opponents. If you buy or sell merchandise about drinking your rival's tears, you are far from the realm of philosophy. Next, note that dialectic is a conversation, not a monologue. It's a dynamic interaction of minds and thus cannot be scripted. And as a result, it requires the presence of mind developed in contemplative practice. It's also worth observing here that this is one of the key reasons why classical texts are essential to philosophical education. It's not as if past thinkers have somehow passed through the veil of illusion and simply handed us the unvarnished truth. Instead, great books are dialogue partners, challenging our assumptions and presenting us with different ways of looking at the world. Contrary to stereotype, canon establishes and protects intellectual diversity. Finally, dialectical dialogue is a process of rational questioning, unfolding in a series of questions and answers. These questions may involve asking for definitions, like what do you mean by that? Asking for evidence, like why should I believe that? Or what is the evidence for your position? Or asking for the consideration of counterarguments, like how is this consistent with that? Or doesn't your position entail that bad outcome over there? By engaging in such a process, we refine our views and come closer to the truth. Dialectic presents us with a virtuous cycle in which we ascend ever closer to an adequate view of reality. This can be seen in Hegel's use of the German verb aufheben to characterize the process. Aufheben can mean to cancel, preserve, or to pick up. In the same way, in dialectic, some claims are cancelled and that they are proven to be wrong. But they are not wholly rejected, since the basic explanatory motive of the position is preserved along with its more adequate elements. And finally, the position is lifted up to a higher level by being placed in a broader explanatory framework. The third core practice of philosophy is creation. This is expressed by the Greek word poiesis, which is defined as fabrication, creation, or production, as in a poetic composition. It comes from the verb poeo, which means to make, create, bring into existence, compose, write, or cause. People often fail to note that philosophy, no less than poetry or art, is a creative endeavor. To respond appropriately to the dialectical dance, you need to be able to create new concepts, frameworks, and systems. Deleuze, for example, goes so far as to define philosophy as, quote, the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. Or more rigorously, philosophy is the discipline that involves creating concepts, end quote. Likewise, the importance of creativity can be seen in Nietzsche's hierarchy of the camel, the lion, and the child in his three metamorphoses. The camel seeks out difficulties and proves himself by bearing much. He bears the burdens of the laws, thou shalt. The lion, in turn, rebels against this, asserting, I will, against the thou shalt of the law, shouting a sacred no in defiant freedom. But the highest stage, claims Nietzsche, is that of the divine child. For the child can utter a sacred yes and create new values. Nietzsche asks, quote, what can the child do that even the lion could not do? Why must the praying lion become a child? The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, my brothers, a sacred yes is needed. The spirit now wills his own will, and he who had been lost to the world now conquers his own world, end quote. The final core practice of philosophy is spiritual transformation. This is expressed in the Greek concept of theurgia, which means divine work, sacramental rite, or mystery. For our purposes, we can define it as a spiritual practice meant to lead one to union with absolute reality. Just as theology, theos and logos, is rational discourse about God, so theurgy, theos and ergon, is God work that prepares one for non-discursive knowledge of the absolute. In this way, it is similar to the Chinese concept of qigong, qi for universal energy, and gong for work. It is thus no surprise that philosophy has been associated with a variety of spiritual practices throughout its history, such as qigong, tai chi chuan, yoga, meditation, shamanic journeying, Jungian dream work and active imagination, astrology and astral magic, alchemy with its idea of the philosopher's stone, and contemplative prayer. We can see the importance of the spiritual dimension of philosophy in Plato's seventh letter. This is one of the few instances we have of Plato speaking of his philosophy in his own voice, rather than through fictional characters in his dialogue. Plato confesses, quote, there is no writing of mine about these matters, nor will there ever be one. For this knowledge is not something that can be put into words like other sciences, but after long continued intercourse between teacher and pupil, in joint pursuit of the subject, suddenly, like light flashing forth when a fire is kindled, it is born in the soul and straightway nourishes itself, end quote. Or again, he notes that, quote, by repeated use of these instruments, ascending and descending to each in turn, it is barely possible for knowledge to be engendered of an object naturally good, in a man naturally good. But if his nature is defective, as is that of most men for the acquisition of knowledge and the so-called virtues, and if the qualities he has have been corrupted, then not even Licinius could make such a man see. In short, neither quickness of learning nor a good memory can make a man see when his nature is not akin to the object. For this knowledge never takes root in an alien nature, so that no man who is not naturally inclined and akin to justice and all other forms of excellence, even though he may be quick at learning and remembering this and that and other things, nor any man who, though akin to justice, is slow at learning and forgetful, will ever attain the truth that is attainable about virtue. Nor about vice either, for these must be learned together, just as the truth and error about any part of being must be learned together, through long and earnest labor, as I said at the beginning. Only when all of these things, names, definitions, visual and other perceptions, have been rubbed against one another and tested, pupil and teacher asking and answering questions in good will and without envy, only then, when reason and knowledge are at the very extremity of human effort, can they illuminate the nature of any object." End quote. So, for Plato, you must not only strive to be intellectually sharp, but to be spiritually good if you hope to one day see the form of the good. These, then, have been the four core practices constitutive of philosophy: contemplation, dialectic, creation, and spiritual transformation. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope that, even if only in a small way, you might come away with a new appreciation for the examined life and the practice of philosophy. Until next time, I'll leave you with some concluding advice from Plato. You must picture the extent of the undertaking, describing what sort of inquiry it is, with how many difficulties it is beset, and how much labor it involves. For anyone who hears this, who is a true lover of wisdom, with a divine quality that makes him akin to it, and worthy of pursuing it, thinks that he has heard of a marvelous quest that he must at once enter upon with all earnestness, or life is not worth living. And from that time forth he pushes himself and urges on his leader without ceasing, until he has reached the end of the journey, or has become capable of doing without such a guide and finding the way himself. This is the state of mind in which such a man lives. Whatever his occupation may be, above everything and always he holds fast to philosophy and to the daily discipline that best makes him apt at learning and remembering, and capable of reasoning soberly with himself, while for the opposite way of living he has a persistent hatred.